Welcome to Abiding Creatives Podcast, where we talk about art, faith, and caring for your creative soul. I'm Haley, an artist and writer learning to faithfully follow Jesus in my creative calling. And this is the podcast for all of us makers, dreamers, and ones created to create, who are ready to let go of striving and discover the joy and freedom of creating with Jesus. Welcome back to Abiding Creatives Podcast. Today we're talking about how creativity reveals our true identity as God's beloved kids. I'm so excited to be talking about this topic because identity is such a powerful part of living out our creative calling. We really need to be rooted in our identity to withstand the highs and lows of the creative life. But getting to that place of feeling secure and confident in who God created us to be is a journey. So let's talk about it. Now, before we get into the episode, I would love it if you could like, share, and leave a comment on this podcast. It would mean so much to me if you could help me spread it to all the creatives who need to hear. Now, let's dive in. So maybe you're a creative like me who really wants to know your God-given calling and why God made you creative, what He wants you to do with those creative gifts. I know that I have often gotten very stuck and fixated on trying to find this purpose, and it got me stuck in cycles of performance and shame, and really actually kept me from living out my creative calling. And this happens when we set out to try to find our purpose without being rooted in our identity as creatives and as children of God. I don't know about you, but I've spent a lot of time trying to use my creative gifts to prove my worth and earn value. And this is often reinforced in our performance-driven worlds. And if we're not careful, we end up creating out of anxiety and insecurity when God already delights in us and approves of us as His creative kids. And like we talked about in previous episodes, even if we understand this somewhat in our heads, it's not easy just to flip a switch in our hearts and start creating out of this sense of belonging and acceptance. Because there's often years of wounds and lies, depending on our experiences, that we have to weed through in order to embrace our creative identity. I know for me, I struggled to embrace my creative identity because parts of my creative personality made me feel different growing up. And at the same time, I often found my identity in how good of art I can make and the praise that it brought from my parents and teachers and peers. Let's be honest, there's some very real things that can get in the way of embracing your creative identity. Whether it's shame for having dreams that look different than other people, or making something and it not being well received, or fears that were placed on you growing up about the instability and unpredictability of creative work, and so discouragement from going down those paths. There can be wounds from being misunderstood or your art being rejected, and all of this can lead to believing some big lies about your creative identity. But if you really want to live out your creative calling in a healthy way, it's worth taking time to unpack these things that are blocking you from embracing your creative identity. No matter how you see yourself as a creative today, you're always being invited by God to explore how He sees you, because He has such a good perspective and has a purpose for you. So maybe you're wondering what's next to start healing and embracing your creative identity. I want to share some of my story in hopes that it encourages you to see some of the practical ways that God goes about healing our creative identity. It's obviously not the only ways that God can heal us, but I find it helpful to hear other people's experiences because it's often in those stories that God is inviting me to see how He can do the same for you and me. So like I mentioned before, I struggled for a long time to embrace my creative identity because it often made me feel different, especially in the church that I grew up in. It didn't necessarily mean that I felt like I didn't belong there, but I didn't feel like there was room for my creative side. I didn't see a lot of forms of arts besides music, and so I always questioned why God made me this way and didn't really know what to do with my creative gifts in a way that would glorify Him. Didn't know it for a long time, but this was a form of rejection that made me reject some of my creative identity. I graduated during 2020 and entered a wilderness season where God started to expose some of my performance-driven tendencies and the masks that I was living out instead of in my true identity. Part of this being my creativity. And as I started to allow Jesus to come close and heal my heart and also remind me of who he created me to be, also started to invite him into my creative practice, into making art. And it really brought to life parts of myself that I didn't know had kind of become dormant. I started to see how creativity was woven into the way God made me and that it was part of my authentic self. Now, part of unraveling from these false identities included discovering the truth of who God says we are. And I meditated on verses like Genesis 1:27 that talks about us being created in God's image, or Psalm 139:14 that talks about how we're fearfully and wonderfully made, or Ephesians 2:10, which is one of my favorites. It says, "For we are God's masterpiece. He's created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do good things he planned for us long ago." Really contemplating these verses and getting it into my head and heart that this is who God says I am really helps me to embrace the parts of me as a creative and just as a human being that I had struggled to embrace in the past. Another thing that really helped in this healing process was becoming more present to God's presence and spending more time with Him. I became more intentional about slowing down and engaging in the kind of prayer that's less about talking and more about being with God. It gave me space to bring my wounds and frustrations around my creativity to him and allow him to start to heal those places that I didn't realize were so tender and wounded. And it's crazy how simple it is, but just receiving his loving presence really started to heal those areas in my heart. Lastly, I started to embrace my creative identity by inviting Jesus into my creative practice. I would pray while I was painting, and that really helped me be more present to him and speak to him about what I was creating. It made creating more of a contemplative experience, and it brought a spiritual element to it that I hadn't experienced before. I started asking the Spirit to show me what you want me to create, and that was a way that I got to practice prophetic gifts and really create with God instead of just creating for Him. The more I got curious about who God made me as a creative, the more it became clear what my purpose was with my gifts and the kinds of works that He wanted me to create with Him. And it's led to so many amazing opportunities and projects that I never would have expected. The sense of purpose that I was searching for came when I finally started to embrace my creative identity. So, if you're struggling to understand your purpose for your creative gifts, I really encourage you to start asking God who He made you to be, how He sees you as a creative, and start to get curious about that because it's led to so much more fruit than all of my striving to try to make something of myself. And so, I hope you discover the same. As we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with a few reflection questions. What aspects of your creative gifts do you tend to seek your identity in? In what ways do you struggle to accept your God-given creativity? How might God be inviting you to heal and embrace your true identity as His creative kid? Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really enjoyed exploring this idea of embracing our true identity as creatives in order to encounter and discover our purpose. And I hope that it leaves you with some questions to ask the Lord and seek Him about to start to understand your creative identity because it's so important and it is the key to discovering your creative calling. I'd love to hear what this episode brought up for you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the next episode.